Hello, I'm Liselle Sambury and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things writing, traditional publishing, and a little bit of reading. And today is the perhaps long-awaited, certainly long to do, full beat sheet example for the Save the Cat Deep Dive series. If you haven't heard of this series, it's something that I did on my channel called the Save the Cat Deep Dive, in which I talked about all the different beats of the Save the Cat story structure and how I personally use them in my own outlining and plotting, some of the things that are outlined in the beat and how I utilize that for my own stories. And so that whole series is based off of the knowledge that I gained from reading Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody, as well as just my experience writing novels. My fifth published novel came out this year, and so just my experience working on different stories and using the Save the Cat structure in that way. So I recommend that the first thing you do is, if you have never heard of Save the Cat before, that you go and read one of the Save the Cat books, either that Jessica Brody one I mentioned. There's also another one by Blake Synder, who is the origin of the story structure, as I know. And after you have done that, then you can watch the whole series. I have a playlist which I have linked down below, including the video I made about creating complex characters, which I also reference quite a bit in this whole series, and that you go watch the whole series and then you can come here and watch this full beat sheet example. Because what is going to be happening in this video is that I'm really going to be referencing terminology and things that I have talked about throughout the Save the Cat Deep Dive series, and I'm not going to redefine things. I'm really going to be sharing what is in the example, so what I've put down for that beat, and then explaining the choices made for what I did in this beat, and then kind of moving on from there. Otherwise, if I redefined everything, this series would be this whole video would be even longer than I'm sure it's going to be, and it's really referential to the series. This is not the explaining the beats, and so that is the order that I recommend you watch things in order to get the most from this example. And then talking about the actual example, this is of course just an example, so please do not judge the value of the story. And I know that like most people watching the channel wouldn't do that, but there's always one person that's like, wow, is this the sort of story that you would publish? No, it's not. That's why I'm making it an example. So that is what it is. And if any of you have watched the workshop I did with The Fold about layered plotting, this is the same story from that example, but I have done some tweaks and things I've adjusted that I thought fit better for the Save the Cat beats. So if you are recognizing the story, there will be some differences and changes that you may notice as well. So that's pretty much how we're gonna proceed with this video. I am gonna share some sort of key information first, but after that I'm gonna go through the beats one by one, and basically tell you about what I've put down and then go into that explanation. I've also included a like a reference sheet, which I will link down below for you to download. Note that when you click the download link, you are saving a copy for yourself, or just downloading it as it will. And this includes everything, all of the details about what is in the beat. It has a link back to this video, and it also has character sheets for the main character and the love interest slash B story character. And so you will have absolutely all of the details in that sheet. And so sometimes I may not go into everything that was in the sheet when I talk about it in this video. So you have that reference sheet to look back on. And so I think that is all of the housekeeping wrapped up. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's begin with some of the need to know information. So this is some things off the top that I think you should know before we proceed into the rest of the video, so that you can kind of have an understanding of the scope when we go into the beats. So I'm going to start with a synopsis of this example. So the synopsis is, 16-year-old Izzy is a witch from the weakest faction in a city of both magic and non-magic people, and her dream is to break away from wishing for more like the rest of her family and fully embrace a non-magical life. But when several high-ranking witches from the strongest faction vanish into thin air and her grandmother is blamed, Izzy is forced to team up with the deeply unlikable son of her employer, whose parents were vanished, and use the very magic she's been trying to escape to clear her grandmother's name. So there you go. So now this is, for example, like when you have your initial story spark, or you think of the idea of what is the story that I want to create, and then you're going to go into creating your Save the Cat beats. This is like perhaps some of the information you might have. You have an idea of the main character, you know what the conflict for the book is going to be and what she's going to try and do, or your main character, whoever, is going to try and do over the course of the story. And so that's why I provide that synopsis. And now I'm going to share some of the things from Izzy's character sheet, who is the main character. Again, this is all in the reference document in full, but right now I'm just going to talk about the lie and the wants and the needs, because as part of my process of using Save the Cat, I create the character first using these character sheets, which is in that video that I talked about in the playlist about creating complex characters. So I use this character sheet to create the character first, and then I develop all the Save the Cat beats on the basis of that character journey. And so that's why I start with that. And so I recommend just taking a look through that character sheet to understand what we're kind of starting with. And I will reference the character sheet in different aspects of it throughout the video as well. But I just wanted to share Izzy's the lie that she believes, the want, and the need. So the lie that she believes is you cannot overcome innate talent. What she wants is to save her grandma, and what she needs is to understand that it's worth trying to achieve what you want, even if your lack of innate talent makes that difficult. So as I go through the story, we'll talk about it more. I won't get into it here, but I just want you to be able to have that information going forward. Jumping right into the opening image. So Izzy's faction of witches attempt a group spell to turn the tides of their poor fortune and fail, a ritual which Izzy refuses to participate in. Izzy believes that her faction is cursed and thinks it's best that they live normal, non-magical lives rather than trying to strengthen their magic. She believes that it's important to accept your place in the world instead of trying to live beyond it. So why this opening image? So there are a few things working here. So for one, when I'm going into this opening image, I already know that the catalyst of the story is going to be this kidnapping of the other witches. So I already know from the start that that's what it's going to be. So I'm aware of what I'm building up to from the beginning. So I want to give enough time to establish Izzy's world and all of that before I get into it. And so I want an opening image, of course, that I want readers to be interested, to grab their attention, to kind of get them to stick in and keep reading. And so to me, this idea of like a bunch of witches doing a very flashy sort of ritual is something that's intriguing. It's something that's kind of like, okay, like why are they doing that? And what are they trying to accomplish? And what's going on? And so I'm imagining an opening scene beginning with maybe Izzy's perspective of them doing all of this stuff and them organizing their little like circle and like flashes of light and like something that's kind of exciting in that way. And then you come to realize that Izzy is not participating in this. So like, why isn't she participating in it? Is she, allowed? Is she not allowed? And then of course, the faction kind of spectacularly fails at doing this ritual. You can see that Izzy is very like ashamed of this whole thing. She's really embarrassed by them, and she didn't participate, not because she like wasn't allowed or she's too young, but because she thinks this whole thing is futile and she's kind of used to them failing in this way. So then that opening image kind of sets up a few different things. We get a hint at kind of the lie that Izzy believes. Like she does feel that everything they're kind of doing is futile because they don't have that sort of innate talent. We set up a little bit of like the kind of world that she's living in that, okay, she's a witch, she lives with other witches, they like do communal spells, that sort of thing. And so those are the choices that I thought about with this opening image. Of course, you could do many different kinds of opening images. That's the thing about the Save the Cat structure, even though it is like a uniform, well, even though it is a set out structure, I will say, not a uniform structure, even though it's a set out structure, you can get a lot of different stories, a lot of different choices. But this is what I presented for that example. For theme stated, the theme of the novel is that it's worth fighting to live the life you want, even if it's easier to just give up. And so what I have down is like a kind of extended of the theme stated is Izzy is frustrated with her family and asks why they keep doing these things, like the ritual, and her grandmother insists that it's worth it for her. Izzy finds this to be sad and thinks they are making their lives harder than they need to be. She does not see her choice to pursue a non-magical life as giving up, but rather as being realistic. She plans to do well in school and attend non-magical university. In the case of the theme, it is complementary to what Izzy's, the lie that she believes in, what she needs to discover. They go hand in hand, and I usually do that on purpose because I'm going based on the character sheet. It makes sense to make the theme what the character needs to learn, because then it kind of comes together in the end. And of course, stories have multiple different themes. There can be themes of like family and friendship and all those sorts of things. But when I'm talking about Save the Cat, I'm like picking a specific themed thing because I know that this is what we are always going to come back to, and that is why it's so complementary to the lie that the character believes in, what they need to learn, because it just comes together and it makes the story kind of click into the character journey, if you will. And I will note that this is not like a perfect theme stated, such as what Save the Cat might say or might imply, in that, of course, no one is actually saying to Izzy, you have to work hard to fight for what you want. Nobody's saying that to her. It's really just kind of her thought process of being like, there's no point in them doing this because they just kind of don't have the level of magic it takes to get to what they want. And her grandmother kind of pushing against that and being like, I think this is worth it. Doing this stuff is worth it to me. And that kind of clash of those beliefs to me is a way of stating the theme without stating it. So to give an example of theme stated without necessarily having a character kind of sit down and say, and this is exactly what's happening, but you can get the feel of the theme, and it's the sort of thing that's going to come out more in the story as it goes on. So even if the reader doesn't have a perfect, like, I understand absolutely perfectly what the theme is, there is a feeling of, okay, I get that she doesn't think this whole magic thing is worth it, but her grandmother and her faction, they do think it is, even though they know that they are weaker. Going straight into the setup, I'm going to talk about these different breakdown areas when I go into talking more about this, but I'm just going to go through them quickly. So the initial goal is to get permission from her parents to attend a summer intensive that will help her with her university applications. So in her home life, I'm not going to go through every bullet, but just kind of quickly, she's embarrassed by her parents who are capable enough to get non-magical jobs, but keep pursuing magic in lower positions. She often avoids home so she can spend more time outside of the magical community. She avoids participating in rituals, that sort of thing. Her work and school life, she's very popular at her non-magical school, which she's worked very hard to integrate into. She works part-time helping her parents with their work for a magical employer, which she does not care for. She doesn't make any attempt to impress higher faction people the way other people in her faction or her parents might do. She is not trying to increase her magical status. Her relationships, she has a strained relationship with her parents because of their relentless pursuit of, you know, higher magic capability, which she finds embarrassing and kind of fruitless. But she does have a better relationship with her grandma, who has a bit of a foot in both the magical and non-magical worlds. And she used to have a best friend who's also a witch, but they've fallen out of favor as she's pushed to be more of a non-magical magical person. And then the status equals death here, which again, I'll talk about more in a second. Magic is a very use it or lose it type skill in this world. And so the more that Izzy pulls away from it, the more she risks losing her magic forever. I went through a lot of things just now, so I'm going to break those down kind of section by section. And I'm going to start with that home life, work/school life, and relationships bucket. So if you have filled out the character sheet, you have already done these things. You've already done all those bullet points. And so I've just taken them from Izzy's character sheet and I've put them into the setup. But when you are doing these things, when you're doing them both in your character sheet and in this kind of Save the Cat setup bucket, the reminder that you're thinking about how this ladders back to the lie that the character believes, and how this ladders back to the things that they initially want in the story. So I know that Izzy's want is to save her grandma, but that only really happens at the catalyst. There's something else that she wants in the beginning. And so that's why I created that initial goal section. So this is something to give the story forward momentum and to give the character something to want before we get to that catalyst moment. And this is to help so that your setup doesn't feel like stale or boring or like you're just doing a bunch of setup, really. And so these are kind of the things that I'm thinking of. And so I created that initial goal of, you know, asking her parents permission to go to this summer intensive because it's something that is non-magical, and her parents are very focused on trying to move up in magical society. And so she knows right off the bat, this is not going to be an easy goal. They are not going to want her to spend even more time in the non-magical world, especially because we know that stasis death moment is that she needs to keep using her magic in order to keep having magic. And if she continues entrenching herself in the non-magical world, she is going to eventually lose her magic. And so her parents are not going to encourage her to do more things in the non-magical world, especially given their goals of status and trying to move themselves up. And so it's a goal that is difficult for the main character. And so there are a lot of things that could come off of this in that, okay, so now I have kind of ideas for chapters in this setup. So having to ask her parents permission. Maybe she goes to her grandmother first, who she has a better relationship with, and tries to get her help with convincing the parents. Maybe when the parents ask her to come and help with a shift at their employer's house, something that we know from that list that she doesn't like doing, she agrees this time around because she's trying to, grease them up a little bit. I don't know if that's the right term, but she's trying to appeal to them so that she can then ask for this big thing later, which, like, I don't know, if you've been a teenager, I feel like you've perhaps done this before with your parents. You kind of like do something like extra and you put in extra effort that you might not have so you can ask for something later. And so that's kind of why I like having this initial goal. I think it really helps with all of those things. And so it gives you ideas of what you can do in chapters for the setup. It's also great because then you can create consequences for the chapter. So, maybe she asks her grandma if she can ask them, and then her grandma eventually turns her down. Or, she goes to the employer's house and she messes up. And so her parents are now mad at her and she still has to ask them for permission to do this thing. And it makes it even harder. It just gives you a little bit more dynamicness to play with. And so that's why I chose that as an initial goal, because it's not something that's easy. And then while you're having her kind of do that initial goal in those scenes, you can do all the other setup things. So you can establish that she has a better relationship with her grandmother than she has with her parents because she has a better foot in the non-magical world. You can have her grandmother or someone or her parents talk about the fact that, like, you need to keep using your magic because if you just stop, you're going to lose it, which we may discover is something that Izzy actually thinks that she wants. She thinks it would be easier if she just didn't have magic at all because she doesn't even like it. She's not even using it. She thinks the whole thing is very fruitless. You can have a scene in her school, maybe with a non-magical teacher kind of encouraging her. You can see how popular she is with other non-magical students, and maybe hint at this sort of relationship that is difficult with her friend. And these things that I've picked also in the like home life, work, school life relationships are also things that have long-term consequences throughout the full story. So they're not things that I'm just going to talk about in the setup and then they're never going to be mentioned again. They're things that are going to come up. So the fact that Izzy used to have this friend who she's no longer close with because she's rejecting all of the magical parts of herself, how is that going to come into play after the catalyst and she's forced into this magical world? You know, that can come into play later down the road. Maybe she has to interact with that friend again. Maybe she needs help from that friend. And so all these different things that you are putting into these buckets, trying to think of ways that they can, you know, go across the story. And that's why I've picked out those specific things. And now the catalyst. So Izzy and her parents are tasked with working an event with the most powerful witch faction, which the most powerful witch faction is hosting. Multiple faction groups are in attendance, including their own. During the process, a spell is triggered which whisks away Izzy's employers and a number of other high-level witches. When the witch community investigator does a standard spell to find out who cast the vanishing one, Izzy's grandmother is implicated and detained. Izzy refuses to believe that her grandma had anything to do with this, and there's only one person who believes her. Unfortunately, it's the pompous son of her employers, Tristan. This catalyst moment does in fact force Izzy out of her previous world and into a new world, in that now she is living in this world without her grandmother, who, as we established in the setup, is the one person in her family that she really does feel like she has a proper connection with. And now her grandma is being falsely imprisoned and no one else is really doing anything about it, because it has already been kind of proven. And so she is forced into this new world of magic, because before in the setup she was determined to cement herself further in the non-magical world. But now that her grandma has been detained in this way, it is clearly something in the magical world. There is a magical solution to this problem, and so she has no choice but to interact with the thing that she's been avoiding. This also butts up right against her lie, because her lie says that she can't really solve this problem because she doesn't have the innate magic, but she's also not going to hang her grandma out to dry. And so there's a push against the lie right from that catalyst moment, because it's already challenging what she believes. And on top of that, for challenging, we also have the one character who believes her is Tristan, who is from this higher magic faction. And so he has a lot of innate magical talent. And so that also can create this situation in which working together with him is just going to exacerbate feelings of inferiority and shame, and like that she does not have enough magic to be able to help her own family. But it could also be the reason that she is forced to team up with him, because again, she has that belief in the lie that she cannot do this. And so, you know, I'll get more into that as we get down the line. But really that's why I've chosen this catalyst moment. Is it's designed in a way such that it forces Izzy into this new world. And again, it's not a physically new world. She's in the exact same world. She's not going on an adventure, but things have shifted mentally. And she can't just go back to her regular, everyday, non-magical life because her grandma is not there now. And that just fundamentally changes how she exists as a character. And so the world has changed for her now. Again, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself of like the talking about going into the new world, because we're technically not there at the beat sheet yet. But the catalyst to me is kind of like the hint of what's coming. Like the world, the second world is kind of hurtling towards her. Yeah, it's a little bit of the threat, I suppose, of that. For the debate, Izzy has to make the decision about whether or not to team up with Tristan to figure out what's really going on and free her grandmother, especially since it will require that she use magic. While her faction isn't very powerful, the vanishing magic used was a form of her family's specialty, and thus they'll need to use that same power to help them find the true culprit, which is exactly why Tristan says he needs her help. Plus, she can use more non-magical means of investigation that witches might not think to use. And internally, she knows she doesn't have the ability to do this on her own. So those are kind of the thoughts going into the debate. This is a decision debate versus a preparatory debate. As I talked about in that debate video, I just don't like prep debates. I just don't think it's very like fun or entertaining or engaging, so I just don't do it. So this is a decision-based debate, and it's really about like, do I work together with Tristan to do this thing, or do I just abandon it, leave it as it is, and not have my grandma and let my grandma be falsely imprisoned. And so it's kind of the sort of debate that has an obvious answer. And sometimes I feel like the debates are like this. There is an obvious answer. And so this debate is really not as much about her like making that decision, but more about the mental process of her dealing with the fact that she does have to make this decision. And like, clearly this is what she's going to do. She's going to work together with him to do this. And even exploring other options. Like, she might think briefly, maybe I could do this by myself without him. But again, based on the lie that Izzy believes, she does not think that she has the ability to do this. She does not have the innate talent. And therefore is unable to do this difficult thing. But you know, the idea of, okay, if I work together with Tristan, that changes it a little bit because he does have the innate talent. And are there other tools that she could use in order to help out? And so that kind of feeling of maybe I could use kind of non-magical investigation techniques to get around things. It's also a means of kind of getting around her lie. She doesn't have the innate magic, but if I use non-magical techniques that witches might not be, you know, privy to, then that's kind of like, it lets her investigate, it lets her do the thing, but it also kind of circumvents the lie that she can't do it. And so this is also something that can come up again, and that she can struggle with throughout the book, this kind of feeling of inadequacy, which she was previously able to avoid because she just entrenched herself in the non-magical world. And so she didn't have to think about her own inadequacy around her magic, but now she absolutely will, going into this new world, this magical world. For the break into 2, Izzy decides to work together with Tristan because she feels that she can use non-magical means to prove that her grandma is innocent. After all, she was blamed purely because of the spell going back to her without any other evidence. Izzy is convinced that non-magical material evidence can prove her innocence, and she can rely on Tristan for anything that requires magic. She promises herself that once her grandmother's name is cleared, that she will separate herself from the magical world and all its nonsense for good. As I've talked about before, the break into 2, we are entering the new world, and for Izzy, this is a new world because she has spent so much time pulling herself away from the magical world, and so she's going into this non-magical world where she had non-magical goals into this new magical world where she now has magical goals, unfortunately. And she is fixing things the wrong way in this case because she's determined to solve this issue by non-magical means and to solely rely on Tristan, who has innate talent, in order to do the magical aspects of whatever they're going to need. And so again, this is the way of her kind of like circumventing or getting around the lie she believes in, you know, and that feeling of inadequacy, in that she's like, well, I'm not going to do that stuff. Like, I'm just going to do all the non-magical stuff and he's going to do the magic stuff and everything is going to be fine. And I don't have to think about how I don't have to think about trying to overcome my innate lack of magic, which according to the lies she believes is not something she can do anyway. And so that is how we are heading into the Act 2 world. Onto the B story. Tristan enters Izzy's Act 2 world as an ally instead of a boy she'd previously disliked and ignored. He will help Izzy learn that it's worth fighting to decide your own fate instead of passively accepting the hand that you've been dealt. And Izzy will help Tristan learn that you can still achieve things without magic. So that is how we're going into the B story. Now we're going to take the time to talk about Tristan, who is the B story character and the love interest in this story. The choice for B story character in this is really simple just because there's a love interest, and so usually when I construct these things, the love interest is going to be the B story character. So a very quick decision to be made about him. But before I even get to this B story point, of course, I've already done that character sheet for Tristan, which if you haven't taken a look at already, I'd recommend taking a look at now. But I will, of course, be talking about him further. And so the thing about the B story character is, of course, Tristan has his own life and his own things that he has been doing before Izzy has come into the picture, but they have interacted before. So he's the son of the employer. And so there can be a scene in the setup in which they've had some sort of interaction in the beginning to establish that relationship, so that then it can be contrasted to the relationship in the Act 2 world. Because again, in the Act 1 world, he was someone that she just kind of disliked and ignored. And in the Act 2 world, they're now allies. Reluctant allies, but allies nonetheless. And so that relationship has changed and has shifted. But again, everything, like the whole life that Tristan has lived, will play into the character, will play into the interactions with Izzy. And again, trying to make sure the B story character is their own kind of their own self-contained character. But also that there is a challenge and sort of a back and forth here. And so we have Izzy kind of going to be learning from Tristan that it's kind of worth going after what she wants, even if, you know, her innate talent makes that difficult. And from her, he is going to be learning that magic is not necessary for achievement, which is the lie that Tristan believes, that magic is necessary for achievement. And then this is going to create its own unique challenge, because later on in the book, it will be revealed that Tristan actually does not have any magic at all. So he has no magic, and he has been spending his whole life using things like potions and magical artifacts and his own kind of skill and wit in order to basically conceal the fact that he doesn't have magic. So he is homeschooled, he doesn't go to a traditional school, and so, you know, he also has the benefit of kind of his parents using their influence to also help conceal the fact that he does not have any magic. And this creates a unique challenge for Izzy, or it will create a unique challenge later on, because remember, she has decided that she's going to rely on him to do all the magical stuff, but he does not actually have any magic. And so to him, he is going to rely on her to do the magical stuff, because he, again, doesn't have any magic, but her magic is kind of, she doesn't have a lot of it. She's not really clued into the magical world, and therefore is less likely to realize that he does not have any magic. And of course, she has that family connection with her family sort of vanishing spell thing that can help, you know, bring them together in order to kind of save his parents. So he has his own goals, he has his own needs and wants and lie and character arc, and she has her own goals and all of that. And this B story creates different ways for those aspects to interact. And so, of course, these are things that I would have had to think about much earlier in the process. So making those character sheets in the beginning, I will usually do the character sheet for the main character and for who I know to be the B story character. So back when I created that, I could fill in that Tristan was not going to have magic, which then of course makes him uniquely suited to be the B story character, because his lack of magic will then force Izzy to use her magic and push against the fact that she shouldn't try or she can't bother with these things that she wants because she doesn't have the innate magic. And so that creates that. And it also, on the other end, creates this thing for Tristan, because for him, he feels that magic is necessary for achievement, and it is incredibly frustrating to him to be paired up with someone like Izzy, who is, in his mind, wasting her magic, wasting her magical talent, not bothering or doing anything with it, even though she's so lucky to be able to have it in the first place. And so you create a sort of on both sides push and pull, which for me and my stories is what I want of the B character. I don't want just something one-sided where Izzy is getting a bunch of what she needs and the B story character is not, because again, I just find it is not a fun dynamic. And so that's kind of everything that's gone into this Tristan B story. And now we get to the big one, the fun and games section. So this is, going through this is going to be a little bit of jumping around, a little bit of back and forth. And so I'm going to be talking about the fun and games in this section, but really this is also going to encompass some of the midpoint and some of the bad guys close-in section as well, because you need to have the midpoint to know what you're working towards, and then the bad guys close-in section to me is really a continuation of the fun and games. But I'm going to start from this section in where I begin the process of kind of the fun and games, which is thinking about all the things that I need to accomplish in this. So in this case, we need to deliver on the promise of the premise, which for this story, to me, magic and romance. Those are the two things we're trying to deliver on. So as long as there's lots of magic and lots of romance, we're doing it. We're delivering on what we said based on the synopsis. So that is kind of that starting point. And so all of the events in the fun and games, I want to be working towards what the character wants, so working towards Izzy's goal of saving her grandma, but also I want them to also be pushing on the need and getting Izzy in that journey toward what she needs, which is that understanding of going for what you want, even if you don't have, even if your innate kind of talent makes that difficult. So that is kind of what I keep in my mind when I'm creating all of these subplots. And so from there, I'm deciding on the subplots. So because I'm assuming this is like a YA fantasy, probably 100,000 word goal, I created 3 subplots. And then also the B story, which I consider another subplot. I consider it to be a romance subplot. In this case, if they were a mentor, it would be a different one, but for the purposes of this example is a romance subplot, and so that's 4 subplots. And then from there, I kind of want to generally decide kind of the different stopping points. And for me to decide that, I need to know what's going to happen at the midpoint. So what's going to happen at the midpoint is that we're going to discover that Tristan's parents were trying to develop a magic stealing spell. So that's one thing. And 2, Izzy is going to learn that Tristan has no magic, which is a secret that he has been keeping throughout the entire story. And so those are the 2 big things that I know are going to happen at the midpoint. And so I am building up towards that through these subplots. And so I'm going to put a little graphic on the screen. Usually these are kind of decided a little bit more chaotically when I'm doing these, but for the purposes of this video, I'm streamlining it a little bit. So because I know I'm going to lay out basically how my subplots are going to be. So I know the B story is going to go throughout the entire novel. And so that already is just like a line through the entire novel. And then I basically set out where I want the other subplots to be. And so because I have 3, it just kind of naturally makes sense to me that 1 will finish a little bit before the midpoint, 1 will finish a little bit after the midpoint, and 1 will finish just before the 3rd act or a little bit after, or during the 3rd act. And that's basically how I've spaced these out in this case. Sometimes when I'm actually brainstorming what's going to happen in the subplot, those sorts of things might shift a little bit, but just the way it's planned out so that you're kind of, you know, I'm getting them spread out enough across the story. And so there's 1 that's going to finish before the midpoint, 1 that's going to finish shortly after the midpoint, and then some, you know, as it looks on the screen, just kind of getting those subplots spread out so that I don't have too many in the beginning, and I don't have too little or too many towards the end. So that's basically that process. So what I'm going to do now is, because I haven't actually said the subplots yet, I'm going to go through these just kind of one by one in this case. So I'm going to now talk about from the sheet the subplot and what it is, and some of the things that are going to be happening kind of generally in the fun and games section, and then I'll talk about the choices behind that. The first subplot, which I've called Acquire Family Spell. So while there's a standard spell being used for making people disappear and reappear, witches from Izzy's faction have an affinity for this sort of magic, especially Izzy's family, which is why her grandma was implicated. So the sort of goal of this subplot is, if they search through Izzy's family records, they may be able to find a spell to bring everyone back, and that can kind of, you know, solve the issue. And so some of the things, so these things that I've listed underneath, these are kind of things that would come up in brainstorming. Usually my process for this would be, I would list everything that would happen in that subplot, and I would brainstorm all the different sort of things that could happen, and then I would spread them throughout the book and plan in that way. The way I've laid this out for you here, because we are going beat by beat, is all of the brainstormed things that will be happening in this specific beat, and so I've broken it up that way, but know that the way this would naturally be done in process is that I would list out all of the subplots and I would brainstorm all the different things that can happen in all those subplots, and then I would spread it throughout the book after, and then kind of play with it there. Again, that's why I say this process is actually more chaotic, but I'm trying to streamline it here. So some of the things that they can do, you know, I'm not going to go through every one of them, but like investigating family spell, you know, discussing things with her parents, you know, discovering that her grandma developed some special vanishing spell, you know, finding hidden artifacts, just things that can ladder up to this mystery. And so because this subplot ends before the midpoint, I also have the resolution for it, which is the discovery that her grandma wasn't strong enough to cast the spell, so she couldn't be the culprit. And this is a win/up subplot because of this discovery. And so I'm going to talk about this more when we get to the midpoint, about like which subplot things are considered wins and which are considered kind of losses, and how that ladders up to the midpoint. But just for the purposes, know that this is a win, and the subplot will end before the midpoint. I chose this particular subplot because for me, it felt like a good way to dive into Izzy's family life. In my stories, I particularly enjoy family themes, and so it was natural for me to come up with this sort of subplot. It also, again, the way it ladders back to her need is that she has this kind of belief of you can't do these things without innate talent, and there's kind of no point in trying. But as she discovers and she learns more things about her family and her family history, it pushes against that lie, because she'll be discovering that her family was able to do a lot of different things that are actually very impressive, even though they don't have a huge amount of innate magical talent. And so kind of discovering that her family was able to use a lot of their different talents that are not necessarily like inextricably linked to magical power to do different things and to accomplish things. And so it butts up against that lie, it challenges the lie, it like pushes her as a character in that way. It also pushes her to, you know, confront her different relationships because, for example, you know, she doesn't have a great relationship with her parents, but now she needs her parents for information. And then, you know, if she wants to get access to her grandma, then she'd have to like kind of get into where she's being imprisoned, and like there's some fun stuff that you can put in there, hence the fun and games of like, is she going to be allowed to get in there? Is she having to sneak in? How is that going? What about how she's getting access to these different records? That also creates opportunities for sneaking around. And in this brainstorm, you'll notice sometimes I put in things to happen, like conflict points, and those are things that you can put in there as well, just to help you kind of build that out and decide what's going to happen. And then we get to that end of the subplot in that they realize the grandma wasn't strong enough to cast that spell, so it couldn't have been her. So it's a win because they've figured out a big clue, and now they know for sure that her grandma didn't do it, but she was still implicated, so how can they get around all of these things? And so that's what went into the planning of that subplot. Subplot number 2, which I've called Infiltrate Summer Program. So the director of one of the magical summer programs that Tristan's parents helped run had recently been having disagreements or having arguments with them, and so is therefore a suspect. If they can both find a way to get into the program, they can use the access to investigate him. Again, remembering that Tristan doesn't have any magic, and Izzy does not have a lot of magic and does not have a lot of belief in her magic. So going right off that, so some of the things they do in this particular fun and games section, the decision to infiltrate the program, there's a program entrance test, her ex-best friend comes in, she's forced to work together with her, so there I was able to pull that in. And then though the subplot doesn't end, by the time we are finished with the fun and games, they're still asking around about the director, and this is a win slash loss. This is a loss slash down subplot because they haven't discovered anything. So they failed to discover anything at this point. So it's counting as a loss. The second subplot I chose because, quite frankly, I think magical schools are fun. I also think it was like a fun little switcheroo because Izzy had wanted to go to this non-magical summer intensive program so badly. That was her goal at the beginning of book, and now she's going to be forced to go to this magical summer intensive program instead. So I just thought that was like fun, and of course I created an entrance exam sort of situation because, again, I think competitions are fun, but also this creates an immediate challenge for both Izzy and Tristan. And so Tristan, again, has been homeschooled this whole time with his parents helping hide the fact that he has no magic, and so he now has to go into a school setting, which will make it even harder to hide that fact, and he has to pass a magical entrance exam, which how is he going to do that without magic? And then also trick Izzy because she doesn't know that he has no magic, and then for Izzy this is its own thing because of, you know, her difficulties with her magic and her belief in her magic and that sort of thing, and so it pushes against the need because succeeding at the entrance exam in some ways shows that like you accomplish this thing without innate magic. So how can that lie be real when actually when you tried you were able to do this even with your kind of lack of innate magical talent? And so that's kind of what the school setting is. And you'll notice that I also, like I said, I brought in that ex-best friend who she was no longer close with as she pulled away from the magical world. This friend is now re-showing up in this magical world and kind of presenting its own challenge. And there are things that can happen later down the line, which I will talk about later down the line, with that character as well. And so there's a few different things being set up, and again this subplot continues on, so there's things down the line. But just to show you that kind of interaction of like the promise of the premise and like doing all the fun magic things that you may want to do in a story, but also making sure consistently laddering back to that need and also to the want, because they're trying to get into this school so that they can investigate this director who they think seems to have had maybe a grudge against Tristan's parents, and so who were among the people that were vanished. So like this is the kind of like suspect that they've decided on. Also because he's the director of a fancy magical school, he has a lot of power and influence and stuff like that. So yeah. And now the third subplot, which is the stealing magic mystery. So this is actually not relevant until the midpoint. However, sometimes there are some things that in this subplot need to be set up at an earlier stage before the subplot actually like officially comes into being at the midpoint. And so that's why I've started it here. Again, when you do this in the more kind of organic way, it makes a little bit more sense. But just so that it's here. So for example, they find some tools that can be used to steal magic, but they don't know that yet. That's something they're going to discover later. And that sort of thing. And so I'm considering this a loss/down subplot because they kind of see different things, but they aren't really putting it together, and they can't really until they get to the midpoint. But I'm still considering it a loss/down section. I will go straight into the B plot because I think what was said about the third subplot kind of sums it up until we get later down the line. But for the B story, so the things that I have bullet pointed in here are things that are planned out using the Gwen Hayes romancing the beats. And so I use these romancing the beats when I'm using a romance subplot. And so that's what these bullet points are coming from. These aren't just kind of brainstormed the way the other subplots are. This came from a separate story structure. And so that's what these are, you know, things like the meet cute and like why they can't work out, that sort of no way Gwen Hayes calls it, and those sorts of things, them being forced to team up, and then some of what they can be doing during the fun and games, which is, you know, Izzy learns about the ways that Tristan is inventive with his potions and artifacts, and how he always refuses to give up, which is admirable, and pushes against her lie. And then Tristan is amazed to discover the talented things that Izzy can achieve and do without magic, which pushes against his lie. And this is just kind of something general, to kind of give you notes throughout the story to keep coming back to that during the fun and games and during all these different scenes that are happening. And though I note these very like generally in that B story section, usually like I'll plan this out a little bit more when I'm at like a chapter portion of doing the outline, but just because it's for the Save the Cat beats, I'm just making that kind of general note because it's kind of enough for filling out a beat sheet. Now for the midpoint, this is a little bit long, so apologies, but I was trying to get everything in there. But Izzy and Tristan decide to sneak into the magical enforcer station to figure out what evidence they have on her grandma and faction. During this process, they discover what seems like notes showing that someone has been stealing magic from witches. With what they've already discovered, they're able to put together that Tristan's parents and someone else were working on how to gain this magic stealing ability, which Tristan knows is because he has no magic. But anyway, then they get caught in a trap and they need to use magic to get out, and Tristan urges Izzy to do it, but Izzy assumes that she cannot do it and instead keeps urging Tristan to, only to finally learn that Tristan has no magic. But Izzy doesn't have any confidence in her ability, and so they get caught. But more painful is that Izzy is unmoored in her lie because Tristan has no magic and yet has successfully hidden this fact his whole life. And now her faction will be in even more trouble because of her actions and her inability to use magic to get out of the situation. So this is a false defeat because Izzy's belief in the lie is why they get caught. It also creates friction between her and Tristan, as he's upset that she wouldn't even try, and she's upset for him. It's upset at him for lying and for succeeding without magic. This also does ladder up to how the subplots have been going up until this point, which is mostly losses and downs. That's why it's a false defeat. Getting into the midpoint, which we already knew what it was because we had to know when we were doing the fun and games. So the midpoint is a plot changing, what is it? Game changing plot twist. There we go. That's what I've chosen to do. As I've talked about when I talk about the midpoint, I always do a twist at the middle. It's just the way I am. But of course, there are different choices for these sorts of things. But this is what I've chosen for the story because I'm putting together the example, and this is what I always do. I always do a plot twist. So the plot twist being that Tristan's parents were trying to figure out how to steal magic. Tristan knows very much that they were probably doing this so that they could find a way to get magic back for him. And so that's what was happening. So they were mixed up in that. And then also Izzy discovering that Tristan doesn't have magic. So the thing about the false defeat is that we remember the false defeat is the lie catching up to the character. And this is very much what has happened for Izzy, in that they have been put in this pressure situation in which they're caught in this kind of magical trap and they need to use magic to get out. And she is like, I'm going to, despite everything she has learned so far, she's still sticking to the line. She was like, Tristan, you have to do this because I can't, because my magic isn't powerful enough. And then this is the one situation in which finally Tristan does not have any potions or artifacts to get out of the fact or conceal the fact that he doesn't have magic, and he is forced to say, I don't have magic, I literally can't. I literally can't. And so she is put in a situation in which she is forced to push against the lie. She's forced to try, but instead of trying, she sticks to the lie. She doubles down on the lie, and she's like, no, there's no way I can do this. I don't have enough magic to do this. I'm not even going to attempt it. And so that's how they end up getting caught. And of course, because they're caught, you know, sneaking into the magical enforcer investigator's office, that creates a lot of issues for Izzy's faction and for her grandma, because it looks like she's doing suspicious shit, essentially, which she shouldn't be doing. And then it creates also a friction between her and Tristan, which the friction on her end is really not even about the lying, which I think she would understand. Okay, of course you would like hide that you don't have magic because you're from a big, powerful, magical family, and that would look bad. But it's the fact that he is still considered a higher faction person, that he has managed to live in a way and be part of the magical community and like be able to take advantage of a lot of privileges despite not actually having any magic, whereas she has like pulled away from her magical community because she's like, you know, there's no way to get better. There's no way to ladder up in this community, and so it's better for me to just like not try and stick to non-magical things. And so it's a little bit of like, it's getting at a little bit of a chip on her shoulder that he has managed to do so much without actually having the innate talent that she assumed that he had. And he has a certain tenacity that she does not. Whereas, you know, on the flip side, it's very frustrating for Tristan that she didn't even try and use her magic, even though she has magic. And for him, if he had magic, he would have done everything possible to get out of there. He would have absolutely used it. He would have done anything with it. And that's something that he very desperately wants. On top of the guilt of the fact that his parents have gotten mixed up in this magic stealing thing that is probably the reason why they were vanished and that all this stuff happened to them, and that he knows that they were doing it because they were trying to find a way to give him magic. And so that's kind of the powder keg of things and emotions we're dealing with in the midpoint. But at the midpoint, of course, we want this shift from wants to needs for the main character, which is not to say that she's going to stop searching for her grandmother, because obviously she is going to still do that. That's more that the external goal is going to continue, but more of this kind of disruption and this very big thing that really challenges the lie. It's the height of the challenging of the lie, which for her is again the fact that she's assumed that you can't do these things without innate talent, but now she has this obvious example that Tristan has been doing exactly that without any magic whatsoever. And so that's a big challenge to her. For bad guys close in, this is essentially a continuation of the fun and games, but I've added a little sentence just of the sort of vibe of the whole bad guys close in section and kind of encompassing all the things to happen there, which is evidence is gathered from Izzy's home and now also implicates her parents in the vanishing, and it's announced that if found guilty, the entire faction will be punished. Izzy begins to doubt whether her faction is as innocent as she originally thought. With bad guys close in, as I said, this is basically a continuation of the fun and games to me, and so I have the same sort of process of kind of brainstorming those bullet points, continuing the subplots. We're basically just keeping on from what we were doing in the fun and games, except in the fun and games when we were working towards the midpoint, now we are working towards the all is lost moment, and the all is lost moment in this case is going to be that Izzy's entire faction is arrested and imprisoned, and they are going to be left for the period of time it takes to do no magic when you lose magic as punishment. And so that is what the all is lost moment is going to be. And so this bad guys close in section is going to be building up to that the whole time. Also happening at the all is lost moment, Izzy and Tristan are going to have a big fight. I forgot to mention that. But getting into the subplot 2, so this is the continuation of the infiltration of the summer program. So, you know, they have some things in there like getting caught snooping and punished, during detention with her ex-bestie, discovers that the girl might know something, discovery of the director's secret, etc. And at the end of the subplot, when Izzy's faction is decided they'll be punished, she's kicked out of the program. And so that is the end of the subplot. And again, we're not really doing lost wins anymore because we're not building towards the midpoint and deciding whether that's going to be a false defeat or a false victory. And so I'm just kind of ending the subplots as they end. With that second subplot, what I'm really trying to do is I'm continuing that investigation, but with a lot more disappointment and a lot more things going wrong, is kind of the theme that I go with, as I talked about in that bad guys close in video, of just things kind of getting worse. And so that's really the theme of that second subplot there. And then getting into the third subplot, which is the stealing magic mystery. So this actually became activated when the midpoint started. And so we have the official start of the subplot. So what it is that now they've discovered that Tristan's parents were dabbling in stealing magic. They need to find the origin of where this research came from, because that person is probably the true culprit. And it seems like whatever was going on with them and their parents is around why they vanished these high-ranking members. Potentially they are planning to steal magic from those people and then proceed with some sort of nefarious plan, as villains do. So that's that. And some of the things that can happen, you know, searching for who has a motive to steal magic, besides Tristan's parents, given his situation, you know, comparing spells, trying to figure out what the ex-bestie knows, that sort of thing. And so that's what's coming into that third subplot, which is continuing on past this section, so is a little bit into the third act. And this subplot actually is going well. They're actually like discovering things are coming together, and this is really like for balance, so that you have a little bit of a bright spot, because again, we are still doing this bouncing ball narrative. You would do that with the little sections anyway, but just making sure there are also some like ups and downs, even though we are trending towards a sort of downward trajectory. And then finally, the B story for this section. So the resentment that Izzy feels for having been treated, you know, poorly her whole life, while Tristan was able to live a higher faction life despite not having magic. You know, Izzy sort of pulling back from him, and Tristan thinks it's because, oh, I don't have magic, and because that's something that he feels ashamed about, and that sort of, you know, a little bit of a miscommunication moment, that sort of thing. And really what I'm doing in this B story section is I am building towards that all is lost moment. So because I know that they're gonna have this big blow up fight, I'm trying to, you know, make note of the seeds that will lead towards that. And I would do this, of course, like much more in detail, doing like chapter planning, that sort of thing. But in the beats, in the context of doing a beat sheet, this is kind of like, to me, enough to know what's going to happen and to kind of give myself an idea of what is going to be built towards. Okay, all is lost. So the tension building between Izzy and Tristan explodes into a fight in which they both exchange some hurtful words. Tristan is hurt because he feels Izzy is treating him different for not having magic while she squanders hers, and Izzy is upset because she doesn't feel Tristan has acknowledged the privilege he has to have lived a higher faction life even without magic. They decide to investigate separately. After Izzy and Tristan fall out, Izzy seeks help from her ex-best friend and is rejected and confronted about the ways her rejection of magic also became a rejection of all the people and things associated with it, like her friend. Finally, Izzy's parents tell her to convince the faction to do a specific spell to change their fate. This could be similar to the one they tried in the beginning. Izzy manages to get everyone to do it, but while it's happening, she doesn't truly believe in their success, and so the spell fails. And just then, the entire faction is arrested because her parents have been found guilty, and now the whole faction will be held without access to magic for 30 days in order to make sure it is lost to them forever. We have the fallout of Izzy and Tristan's relationship and the fall of Izzy's faction. And both these things ladder up to Izzy's belief in the lie. Her belief in the lie is why they had that fight. Her belief in the lie is also why she couldn't wholly believe in the spell, in the ritual, even as she was participating in it, which led to its failure because everyone needed to believe. This is just, we're being a little loose with the world, but everybody needs to believe in the spell for the spell to work. And she didn't believe in it because she's still clinging to that lie, even as she is, you know, switching and sort of leaning, going from the wants to the needs. And her life is different because in the back of her mind, she is remembering all the things that Tristan was able to do even without magic. And so it is directly butting against that. And for her, it becomes this sort of festering of resentment toward him versus kind of learning from the need. She's kind of turned it instead into this thing that like becomes a reason to hate and dislike him, even if she has valid points about privilege. So that's basically what is happening in this case. Is really what for me is the sticking points of this, is like, how can I make sure that what happens at the all is lost moment is at least somewhat to blame for her. And then on the flip side, if we want to do some of that B story entanglement, there is also Tristan's end, in which he is also festering this resentment because of what was discovered, or what happened at the midpoint rather. And so the consequences of the midpoint come through to this all is lost moment because they've been kind of working through it the whole time in that bad guys close in section. It's also a particularly sort of crushing moment for Izzy because as she is coming to slowly appreciate what she can do with magic a little bit more, which is what I would be doing in that bad guys close in section also, because again, we're trying to get that move from wants to needs. So I would probably have her increased using her magic a little bit more. Now that she's been doing that, she's in this situation in which she's going to lose magic. There's also that element of like, this is kind of what she wanted at the beginning of the story. At the beginning of the story, she thought that her faction should just give up and like really embrace a non-magical life and focus on that. These are the things that she wanted for her family and her entire faction, and that she was pursuing herself to just live life without magic. And now she's in this situation which she's technically getting what she wanted from the beginning, but of course now that she's gone through this journey throughout the story, she doesn't want that anymore. But the lie is still persisting in that now they're in this very dire situation, and it very much feels like there's no way for me to get out of this now. Like, this is what's going to happen. Dark night of the soul. So her family no longer having magic, and being forced to live a non-magical life is what Izzy thought she wanted, but she's not feeling that interested in it currently. She and her faction have been held for 29 days now and will soon lose access to their magic. Izzy feels depressed knowing that magic is the only thing she had to prove that they weren't responsible for this, and now they'll lose it. She regrets not having fought harder when she still could. She shares what she's learned with her faction in an attempt to solve the mystery and prove their innocence, and they do discover a big clue. However, they aren't being listened to, and there's no way to use the knowledge to escape their circumstances. In this Dark Night of the Soul section, we have a little bit of the continuation of that subplot of the stealing magic mystery, and we also have some of the B plot development. Even though the B story character isn't there, to me it makes sense to have some of that development still happening even while apart, and so some of that is in there as well. Again, all written in detail in the sheet, but I'm trying to highlight the important bits. But for me, this kind of Dark Night of the Soul moment, I do want to give a little bit of the goal. And so the goal here for Izzy is that she's trying to work collaboratively with her faction to try and figure out a sort of solution to this mystery. And so she shares the things that she's kind of found out, and has this kind of really first real moment of like working together with her faction to solve a magical problem, which, you know, in the beginning she was very separated from them, and now there's a sort of coming together moment, if you will, that she has with them. I will note that in this sort of setup, her parents and her grandma are being kept separately, so this is her first kind of like community interaction, if you will, and then they are able to find that big sort of clue. And then the Dark Knight epiphany moment in here to me is that she has this kind of realization that she accomplished like all of the things that Tristan and her accomplished up until this point. You know, maybe having one of the faction members kind of like be like, wow, like you did all of this on your own, and her kind of realizing, yeah, we did all of this stuff, we discovered so many things, and we did it with like her level of magic and with Tristan having literally no magic, and they were still able to do so many things in like trying and working together and like having that sort of tenacity, and having this moment for Izzy in which she's like, wow, yeah, I have accomplished a lot of things, even in the magical community, with my amount of magic, whereas before she really only gave any sort of praise to her non-magical achievements, and so this time she's, you know, coming together to realize the things that she could do in the magical community and the sort of differences that she could make with what she has. And so that's kind of like the Dark Knight epiphany there, and then the sort of debate going into that sort of like break into 3 section is kind of like, are we going to accept kind of the circumstances we have now, because again, they've discovered that big clue, but nobody is going to believe them or pay attention to them or give them a chance. Do we just accept that these are our circumstances now, or are we going to do something to fight back? And obviously they're going to do something to fight back, but we'll get into that. On to break into 3. So Izzy creates a plan so that the group can use their remaining scraps of magic to get this important clue to Tristan so that he can help. This really forces Izzy to confront the fact that yes, she is inadequate, her magic is weak, but she can use what she does have. She's making the choice to persist with her magic, even if it would be easier to give up and even if she might fail. She's finally learned that yes, sometimes it's worth fighting against your circumstances instead of just accepting what you've got. And so this is Izzy fixing things the right way, in that she's kind of learned this need bit, and that she and her faction are going to do something together collaboratively to get out of their situation, instead of just kind of giving up. It's also, I like this mechanic, this plan idea also, because it gives Izzy a chance to regain a win. It's kind of a little bit of a like a revenge, you know, it gives her an opportunity to make up for that time in the past where they were going to do that collaborative spell and it failed because she didn't believe in it. And so now they have a chance to do something collaborative once again, even with like their little scraps of magic, like finding a way to link up to each other in a way that they couldn't during any other time they were imprisoned for some reason that I would have worked out in the details if I was making this a full book. But they do it now, and this time she does believe, and it, you know, they've got a chance to do it and have everything work out. And so that's the fixing things the right way section of this break into 3. And now we come to the finale. I'm not going to go through every single bullet point. Again, it is on the sheet, but I am going to just generally say these are kind of bullet points of like things to happen in the finale. I try and keep that bouncing ball narrative. I'm also keeping in mind that the main character, even though she has learned, like she's moved from wants to needs, this isn't a perfect transition. This still needs to be challenged. This still needs to be pushed up against, and so keeping that in mind as well. And again, because I don't use the 5-point finale, it looks a little bit different. So that's why I kind of like think about these bullet points. So things like Tristan coming and freeing the faction based on the clue that they were able to send to him. They make a plan for confronting the person they believe is responsible for everything. They try and convince their factions to work together. It doesn't quite work. They have to go first by themselves. They fight. They lose a little bit. They learn some things. They get reunited with their parents. And then the big point of this finale, which is the twist and why I let that that stealing magic mystery continue, which is that Izzy's parents propose a bonding ritual as part of the apology from Tristan's faction now that they've saved them. So as an apology from his faction, they decide to do this ritual, which is a sort of like good faith thing that promises that both factions will uplift each other, and the factions agree. However, what the ritual actually does is steal magic from the powerful faction and give it all to Izzy's faction. And so then it's revealed that dun 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 dun, Izzy's parents actually planned the whole thing and manipulated the villain that they went off to fight and who they thought was responsible, all so they could get to this point of stealing magic from all the powerful witches and giving it to their faction, which they had some bumps in the roads. The plan did not go perfectly, but they adapted and they got to this point. And so that's the big sort of like twist of the finale. And then I've made 2 sections here. Again, I'm gonna go through and explain all these choices in a second. But I have put like how the finale could continue if it was a standalone, and how the finale could continue if it was a series. So if I was planning to make this a series of stories, or if I was planning to make this a standalone, just to give both those options. So in a standalone, both factions fight and win against Izzy's parents, who are imprisoned, and while Izzy loves them, now maintains a strained relationship with them, but finds family in her grandma, the rest of her faction, and Tristan's family. There are efforts made to dissolve the faction system, and the spells are used to distribute magic evenly. Let's say this is an option. Again, this is an example. I'm not sure. It's not going to be the highest quality ever, but it's, you know, it's an example. It's just to give you an idea. Or in a series, you might have Izzy's parents bring the other factions to their knees and usher in a new age. Tristan is exposed for having no magic, but it doesn't matter because his whole faction is stripped of magic now. The tables are turned. Izzy is forced to pretend that she's okay with these developments while she and her grandma try and figure out a plan to fix things and, you know, create a more equal system. And so that way you can have the whole second book being them trying to undo what her parents did or equalize the system or what have you. But it just kind of gives you those 2 options so you can see how a finale might go if I was planning it this way. And really, as I said, what I'm trying to do in this finale is maintain that bouncing ball narrative. narrative. And there are really elements of the 5-point finale in this. And as I said in that video where Jessica Brody recommends at least trying the 5-point finale one time, I do think it is worth it to kind of just give you an idea. I think what the 5-point finale does well is that it forces you to create that bouncing ball, in that it says, okay, this is when they encounter some sort of conflict, and this is when they do this thing, and this is when they do this thing. It's really just kind of making you do that. Whereas what I'm just doing in the bullet points is I'm just creating that bouncing ball narrative by myself. So, you know, they try and bring their factions together and it doesn't really quite work. And so that automatically creates a sort of challenge. It also pushes against Izzy's need, in that it kind of gives her a moment in which she could once again kind of, you know, pull back into herself and try and believe in the lie and just kind of be like, I give up, they're never going to accept that we don't have as much magic as they have, etc., that sort of thing. Again, the fight with the villain, and then them kind of not succeeding and like having more of that push in that way. Also giving Tristan a chance to succeed in some ways without using magic at all. And so that he has some time for his character arc as well. And so that's really the things that I'm trying to pull into this sort of finale to make sure that happens. And then of course the actual like kind of wrapping up of the story. I do like to do late stage twists. I think it's fun. And so those are the sorts of things I enjoy. And so here I have that reveal of the parents that like they are actually the ones that were trying to steal magic, which in some ways reflects also Izzy's lie that she believes. Like her parents are really believing in the same sort of lie, except while Izzy was like, oh, I can't do this because I don't have innate magic, so I'm just gonna be a non-magical person. Her parents were like, we can't do this because we don't have innate magic, so we're gonna find a way to increase our innate magic so that we can do this, and we're gonna do it by stealing magic from people. And so they've developed this whole thing. This is something where when I was doing like my actual detailed plotting, I would set up this whole thing and I'd be putting in all sorts of different clues. I might even at this point, like considering the planning of my subplots, go back into my subplots and add little bullet points for clues for this big twist. That's why really like the creation of this Save the Cat beat sheet is like, to me, I find it very unlikely that you'll be able to go beat 1, beat 2, beat 3 and just go completely in order and fill it out like that. I think that's probably unrealistic. There's probably going to be a lot of jumping around, and I know that I'm going one after the other in this case just to have this example, but probably you're going to be jumping all over the place, making all sorts of changes and like adjusting different sections as things come up and as you come up with more ideas and that sort of thing. So that is, to me, very natural and how I do it when I naturally do this anyway. But yes, so then having that kind of final twist, and then there's a setup for how to proceed if the book was going to end here. So that standalone option, the standalone option is something that kind of like lets everyone come together. It also helps because, again, one of these factions doesn't have magic anymore. And so like continuing to work together despite that, it does come back to Izzy's lie, in that even without magic, even without the so-called innate ability, we're able to do all these things together and we're still, you know, community and able to work together, that sort of thing. I'm trying to ladder all these things back, or in a series it's kind of coming around in a different way. So Izzy had this whole journey of like, I'm going to try even if I don't have the innate ability, and then at the end of this book has like all the innate ability in the world despite learning that for herself. And so you kind of have a setup into like, okay, what is the next book in the series going to look like? How is that going to change? How is that going to be different? And it also creates an interesting situation for Tristan, who has now been like, okay, I didn't have magic all along, and now it's like your whole faction doesn't have magic anymore. And so it's going to be a very different situation for him as well, continuing on in a series. And so those are just kind of like two things I put together just so you can kind of get a good idea of different options depending on series or standalone. And now for the final image, the last beat. So I have again that series and standalone option, starting with the standalone option. The epilogue features Izzy attempting to do a spell that's usually beyond her current abilities, and she succeeds. Then she tries another one that fails. She's content in realizing that this is the way it should be and leaves to have someone else help her do the harder spell, excited to have community to do so. And in the series section, remember this is the ending where the parents usher in the new age. This epilogue features Izzy attempting to do a spell that's usually beyond her current abilities. She's been spending most of her time locked up in her room until her parents decide that she can be trusted. The final image is of Izzy successfully performing the spell. It's bittersweet because she's more powerful, but she's also more trapped and restricted than before. In the case of this final image, remembering that the opening image is the before snapshot, and then the final image is that after snapshot. And so I was thinking about that. Sometimes, again, you want to have a bit of a mirroring effect, and so that's what I did here. It's kind of mirroring that fact that she did that group community spell and she didn't even participate in it and it failed, and like now she's doing this spell on her own, and in that standalone version where everything is complete and we have done the full circle, she's trying to do a spell again, and you know, she successfully manages one. Again, she has more innate magic now, because they've kind of equalized everything. So she successfully does one, but then she successfully doesn't do another, or she does not successfully do another, and that's sort of just like understanding of, okay, well, even though I don't have the innate magic to do everything, there are ways around it. I can still try. And so she goes out into the community to have someone help her do a sort of communal spell, and so that she can succeed at doing it, and that sort of acceptance of not giving up despite my innate ability, as opposed to the series one, in which even when it's a series, like I still want to close out that character arc. The way that some people will do it is they'll have the character have the same sort of arc or lie they believe or whatever throughout a series. I personally don't like doing that, and so I've done the same with this example. Like I want to close out this section of it, so that in the next book in the series I can do a different lie that is a little bit more based on whatever has been experienced in the first book. And so in this case, she goes to do the spell and it's just like, it's super easy because now she has so much innate magic, but it's very like, it's bittersweet because even though, you know, there was that lie, she believed that, you know, if you didn't have innate magic, you can do these things. And now she has all of it. And so she can do all those things. And so it doesn't really matter if she believes the lie or not, because it's no longer really applicable to her. But of course, she's already gone through that journey and learned it. And so now it's like this very sort of odd, bittersweet moment, in that she's aware that she can only do this because they've stolen magic from other people, and Tristan's imprisoned and it's this whole thing, and she's also imprisoned because her parents don't trust her, and so it's less a kind of like coming through of the character journey because she's already done the character journey, and it's more of a hint of like what could the next journey be, while making a comment on the journey that she's gone on already, if that makes sense. So that's really what I was going for with this final image. And that is the full completed beat sheet. Again, I will remind you that the link in the description for the download is down there to get all of the details of everything, also the character sheets. It also includes a link back to this video, so if you have the PDF floating around in your computer and then you forget where the video goes, there will be a link to bring you back, or you can just kind of, you know, if you're reading through the sheet and you're like, I actually want to hear her talk about that again, link back. And I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, but there are timestamps, which I'm sure you've realized if you're watching the video, so that you can jump around to the different beat sheet sections. And what I will leave you with is, again, this does not need to be perfect when you are actually in this process. I have really streamlined this because I wanted to be able to show you like a completed beat sheet of a story idea as an example, but of course it's not going to be perfect right from the beginning. I'm sure even this one is also imperfect. It's really just an example so that I can have one continuous example that I used to show you the different thought processes and the things I think of. But of course, even after I create my beat sheet and then I go and I plan my entire story off of it and I write the book and I put it all together, that's to get a first draft. All of this work for me, when I go into my story process, my outlining process, all of this is just to get a first draft. And that first draft is going to change so often. It's going to change a lot of times. And I don't usually go back and then like change my beat sheet to make sure it matches the changes that I'm doing. I often will just do the changes, move things around, swap things a bit. Sometimes I will go back and change the beat sheet just so that I understand, like I have a roadmap of where I'm going. But often I'm like making changes a little bit more on the fly. And so the final product of the final book that I get is often, you know, it has elements of the beat sheet. I think a lot of the beats stay the same, but all of those little detail things that come into it, tons of those change. A lot of those things change over time. So I wouldn't put pressure on yourself to like have a perfect beat sheet or like get everything right, so to speak, when you put this together. It's really just to give you that roadmap so that you can go ahead and get your first draft done, and you have that base to work off of while you're making your edits and that sort of thing. But probably the final product will end up being quite a bit different, at least details wise, from what you've actually put together. I find that happens with my books. I find that sometimes I will deviate from what the like beat is or like what my plans are for the beats, because I'm making adjustments on the fly, and sometimes I'm adjusting things for the purposes of the story, and so it deviates from the beats a little bit more than I would have when I was originally planning it. So I just wanted to say that, because like when you see something like outlined in like a very detailed like 10-page document as I have provided, I feel like it can feel a little bit intimidating, like, oh my gosh, am I supposed to do all of that? But yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect. And again, this is something that is built up over time. If you need any proof of that, let the proof be the fact that I said I was going to make this video last year, and it took me all the way until May to get this video done, which is like, what is May, like the 5th month, something like that. Yeah, so you know, in my things, it took me a while to actually get everything put together and prepared for even this video. So it is a bit of a process. I will say timeline wise, because I know sometimes people wonder about like how long it takes to do things. I will often take like 3 to 4 weeks to fully plot a novel. So usually I spend one of those weeks doing the Save the Cat beat section. So it usually takes me about a week to fill out a full beat sheet. And that is as a person who writes full time. So waking up at like butt in chair at 9 o'clock in the morning, working probably until 3 in the afternoon with a break for lunch, doing that work consistently. It takes me about a week to do a beat sheet. Just so you have an understanding that like doing something like with the amount of details of what I have put in this sheet takes a while. Just so you understand. Yeah, I just really want to like, I always want to like try and like set realistic expectations. And you know, as I share my process, with you, and you might want to go for it and do this in your own process, I just want to like make sure that I am, you know, pulling back the curtains and being transparent about the process, because the last thing I want is someone to like be like, oh my God, I can't do that. I can never do that. Like that's impossible. Or to think this is like some special skill that I have that like you can't have. Yeah, I just don't want that to be the takeaway. And so that's why I'm saying putting together a beat sheet with the amount of detail that I do in my beat sheets that I put in this example will probably take a while, and will probably be a little bit chaotic, and all over the place, and you will probably make edits to that throughout the process, and that is totally fine and natural, and that is in fact how my process goes as well. So just wanted to say that as a closing before we finish off here. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And thank you so much for joining me on this very long Save the Cat journey to do this whole series, which has taken a while, but I'm so appreciative of all of you that said this was really helping you, and that's why I persisted in this, and that's why I did this, because I wanted that to be helpful. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!